So you want to know which weapons are good or bad in Dead Cells? Well, you've come to the right place. After 4 years since its launch and a handful of updates that have added numerous items to the game, let's go through them one by one and see how each of them hold up to this day. This video will be timestamped by alphabetical order of the weapons by names, so you can always skip forward to your favorite weapon via the chapters. This tier list is from a 5 BC perspective, so I'll be a little harsher on the ratings, as on 5 BC, your setup will start to matter a lot in determining whether or not you will actually win. But I will also mention if certain weapons are good on lower boss cell levels as well. Now, given that 3.0 comes with a brand new Star Affix and Legendary rework, this tier list also assumes that you do not get the legendary version of the weapons. And this time around, I did come together with a group of people that know Dead Cells fairly well, and we've discussed and agreed on all of the weapon tiers so far. My rating criteria is the same as last time, though I want to clarify, regardless of what ratings I give to weapons, you should still unlock all of them if you haven't already. This isn't a multiplayer game with a meta system, so all weapons are created equally. But some are just more equal than others, you know what I'm saying? A D tier item is extremely situational or risky to use. Maybe it can work in a very specific setup, but overall it needs a buff or a redesign altogether. A C tier item can be good in a specific setup or just below average in terms of usability. A B tier weapon is just overall good. Not too strong, not too weak. Average, like your typical harem anime protagonist. Now, A tier is where we're gonna be getting to the good stuff. Not only is the weapon very good at what it does, the damage is noticeably better than items in lower tiers. And finally, obviously this is the top of the tier list, but one thing I do want to state is that a weapon doesn't need to actually have the heaviest hitting numbers to reach the S tier, but rather it needs to have flexibility. Are there multiple ways to use the same item? One thing that's valued a lot in Dead Cells is versatility. If you can use an item in 3 different ways, not only does it increase its usage, it also makes the game more fun from its variety. Plus, it also goes to show that devs are actually really good at designing weapons that are just so flavorful. Finally, let's begin. Starting off, the Abyssal Trident is a brand new weapon introduced in this year's Queen and the Sea DLC. The first hit of the Trident will slash downward, then push everything back, while your character runs forward, and finally doing a jab attack when you want to end the combo. This weapon controls really weirdly, unlike anything I've seen in the game. It's definitely gonna take players a while before getting a general feel for the playstyle. I don't know which other weapons you can pair it up with, though because the crits come out relatively fast on the running attack, there's a lot of potential to be had with cooldown mutations. While the Abyssal Trident did receive a slight damage buff in the latest patch, the sudden movement and the lack of synergies, as well as the fact that you have to be fully committed on using the Trident while attacking, makes it somewhat awkward to use. However, just from the damage alone, I'm willing to put it in A- tier. Continuing right along with the Assassin's Dagger. The critical hit condition is to hit an enemy from the back. Now, if you're new to the game, a lot of the weapons will have a crit condition, and it's in your best interest to meet that condition all the time, because the damage multiplier on the crits are just way better than not critting. Now, being with us since 1.0, the Ass Dagger has a pretty straightforward game plan. Get phasered, wreck all the enemies. Sure, you could just roll behind an enemy and slash away like a noob, but if you're min-maxing damage, having phaser will make all the difference. Since the phaser has low cooldown, you'll want to run mutations that make it active all the time for those delicious backstabs. Also, I should mention that some of the bosses in the game don't technically have a backside that you can exploit like the Giant, so you can never get crits in this fight, so be careful when selecting your biomes. The Ass Dagger gets an A tier from me. The Balanced Blade is also a weapon that was available in 1.0 of Dead Cells. The biggest compliment I can give it is that this is an independently solid item to use. The crit condition is straightforward and pretty easy to meet, provided that you know what you're doing. With some good affixes and some degree of skill in the game, the Balanced Blade can be an absolute powerhouse. It's a weapon that forces you to plan out your attack and not just button mash like a madman. It might actually do a better job of downing bosses than the GiantKiller, whose sole purpose is to down bosses, but we'll get to that weapon later. For the time being, if you like a weapon with a high skill ceiling and just want a lot of ways to make yourself really strong, Balance Blade is for you. This was one of the more discussed weapons, but we settled on A tier. The Bladed Tonfas is also a new weapon from the Queen and the Sea DLC. And out of all the ones released, this one's actually my favorite. While it did receive a damage nerf in the latest patch, just like the Balance Blade, the skill ceiling on this one is probably what makes it stand out. The first strike will cause you to leap forward, and the next hits in the combo will do crits if you landed the first leap. The caveat is that if you aren't counting which attack of the combo you're on, you can reset the combo and leap when you're not expecting it, which will cause you to lose the damage chain. The damage is quite good indeed, and it can serve as a niche support weapon if you just want that first leap to close in the distance for your main weapon. But there are still better alternatives out there that do the exact same thing. Just from its sheer mobility tool and the skill ceiling, I'm barely able to put this one in S-. The BloodSword is as vanilla as they come, it causes bleeding. That's it. How the bleed status works in this game is that if you can get enough stacks on an enemy, it will reset the stacks and deal a big amount of burst damage. So a strategy with the BloodSword is to just fill your entire loadout with stuff that inflict bleed. Rocking the mono bleed build is pretty basic but effective, because DOT effects in this game are just really powerful. If you can get over the fact that this weapon is just really vanilla, I can still give it the A tier since a lot of the weapon you need are already unlocked by default, and it can serve as a good gateway for beginners to understand status mechanics. Even on 5BC, it can hit like a truck. So, this is the first of the survival weapons. If you're new, a general theme with survival weapons is that it's slow but hard-hitting. The Broadsword has a pretty vanilla moveset and a pretty vanilla crit condition. Though by the time that third hit comes out, the enemy is either already dead or you just took some damage. This one's also unlocked right as you begin the game, and I think its main purpose is to introduce players to the feel of swinging a hefty survival weapon. Broadsword gets an A- tier. By itself, it's average enough to stand on its own feet, and can possibly be decent with some good supports. Brownie points for being able to cosplay as Guts from Berserk. Good luck landing that third hit on bosses though. The Bone is the crossover weapon with Skull the Hero Slayer. The gimmick is that if you hit something with the first two attacks, your character will then unlock a third attack where you become a tornado. Now this was one of my favorite additions to the game in the crossover update because the Bone will ask you a question every time you use it. Say you're about to initiate the spin, but the enemy is also about to attack you. Do you become a plebeian and roll out of the way, or do you commit to the roll, hoping that it will kill the enemy before it attacks you? I quite like this mechanic where it makes you decide which play to make, making it one of the more interesting weapons in the game. Coupled by the fact that the damage is pretty good and lands some quick crits, there's a lot of potential to be had. However, I do want to show you something interesting. What if I told you that there was a way to land the entire combo of the spin all the time without ever worrying about getting hit? Well, the magic happens when you pair the Bone with the Rampart Shield. Since the shield will give you a couple seconds of invulnerability after parrying, you can fully commit to the spin without ever taking damage. It's this level of lateral thinking that really brings out how much creativity you can have in Dead Cells builds. As such, the Bone will receive an A+ tier. The Crowbar is a pretty tragic weapon. It's really awkward to run this weapon since the crit condition on it is pretty hard to meet. Not all biomes you come across will have doors for you to break, and in bosses, you literally can't land crits. Yes, you can use the emergency door to make the damage a little bit more consistent, but for some reason the door is tactics and the crowbar is brutality. The door is arguably the weakest deployable in the game since it actually just does 0 damage and has a ridiculous 10-second cooldown for its effect. On top of that, in order for the crit to work, you have to be the one to break the door. If a stray enemy bullet or anything else breaks the door instead of you, then you'll have to wait for the door to refresh before trying again. It can work in biomes, but think about the time that you lose by trying to direct attention from attacking the enemy and trying to break down the door, when you could have just spent that time dishing out more damage instead. They've added another crit condition on the crowbar, which is on enemies considered to be monsters, so not humanoid and not mechanic. Now, I'm not sure what exact enemies this entails because there's no easy way to see who qualifies as monsters. but from what I can gather, it's only a very small subset of enemies, so it's not like you're gonna have a lot of trouble with them in the first place. The playstyle for the crowbar is really one-dimensional. Since you really want the door in order for it to work, not only do you have to be constantly focused on breaking down the door to continue your crit chain, even if you manage to have 100% upkeep on the crits, the damage is just okay. And as such, I'm gonna have to leave it in D tier. The Dagger of Profit was a weapon introduced in the Bank update. The crit condition is quite interesting. Deal crits for 3 seconds after picking up gold. Now immediately this will get you thinking, how can we have 100% uptime on crits? Surely there are gonna be times when you can't kill enemies fast enough to continue the crit chain, right? But what if I told you there are? First off, you can try using Greed Shield to get some money during the dagger's downtime, but something interesting happens when you use the Gold Digger alongside the Porcupine mutation. We'll get to the Gold Digger later, but essentially, hitting an enemy with it will drop some gold, but rolling through them via Porcupine will actually cause the gold drop effect to trigger as well, achieving the same result without taking up a slot in your loadout. And Loquo mutation has a cooldown of 3 seconds. Now, while the Dagger of Profit isn't the hardest hitting weapon in the game, the sheer amount of ways you can satisfy the crit condition makes it, in my opinion, one of the best designed items in the game. I would love to see a damage buff on the dagger because right now I can barely put this one in S-. The Flashing Fangs is able to deflect projectiles from enemies and get crits with it. I can probably give the praise that although the gimmick is tricky at first to pull off, it feels really satisfying if you manage to do it all the time. You have to adjust your timings since you'll need to push the attack button slightly sooner than shields to get it in its attack range, and learning can take a while. On harder difficulties, you'll get punished pretty hard for missing even once. Again, if you manage to master this weapon, you can pretty much solo levels with the Fangs alone. It's worth noting that not all enemies and bosses will fire projectiles at you, but it's an option that I'm happy with using if the situation was just right. Overall, pretty solid weapon sitting at B tier. The Flawless is really good under one condition: if you don't get hit. Now, I'm not gonna bust out the argument where I just tell you to get good, keep chaining crits by not getting hit, but it's not always reliable. There isn't too much of a problem in biomes since you can just wait around a little to get the crits again. However, what about bosses? I find that the Flawless is pretty hit or miss in these situations. If you manage to no-hit the boss, great. But if you get hit at any point, you risk being in this downward spiral of not being able to close out the fight fast enough, which causes you to take damage again. You can try using Ice Armor for a little bit of protection, but even that only lasts one hit. There's also a build out there that combines the Flawless with the Scythe Sword, where if you get hit, you switch to the Scythe Sword and swap back once you haven't taken damage for a while. Pretty nifty stuff. While the Flawless has a lot of potential, the risk during bosses make it quite dangerous to run if you fully commit to using this weapon. And for that reason, I'll need to bump it down to a B tier. The Flint is a weapon that you probably use once or twice. Being a weapon in the vanilla game, it unfortunately lacks variety compared to other options. You can either spam the attack button or hold it down and release it for a crit and a wave of fire. I recommend using the hold attack all the time because the damage is just that much higher. But even as I say that, the overall numbers it dishes out can still fall pretty behind other survival weapons. It's quite hard to use since you have to spend your time charging up the weapon, so you can't even use other items in your loadout at the same time. But the sad truth is that a lot of survival weapons have this issue. Sadly, the lack of versatility and damage catches up to the Flint, which means I'm gonna have to put it in D tier. The Frantic Sword is one of the most unique weapons in the game in the sense that how good it is dependent on which difficulty setting you use it on. The crit condition states that when your life bar is below 50% or the malaise bar is over 50%. Having low HP can be pretty dangerous, but over half of your malaise filled up? Now that's more doable. But there's a problem here. The malaise mechanic is exclusive to 5BC. A lot of games have the issue that the higher difficulty you are on, the less amount of items that are viable since they aren't able to keep up with the difficulty spike. But in the case of the Frantic Sword, it's the exact opposite. Strangely, this is one of the few weapons in the game that's actually more viable on the hardest difficulty setting, so that's gotta count for something in my book. The damage it does is already decent enough, even if you're not critting, and being able to crit constantly with no drawback is just insane. While you can still use it at lower boss cell levels, you're gonna want to run something like Disengage or Tonic to keep yourself safe from being one-shotted. But recall that I did say this tier list is from a 5BC perspective. I'm willing to put it at a comfortable S tier. The GiantKiller is specialized for doing one thing only: killing bosses. Its strict crit condition only works on bosses and elites, and on top of that, this is the only weapon in the game where you can't put inside your backpack. I don't know why that's the case, since you can just play around it by swapping with your main hand weapon and swap back in the next biome. Now, I really don't like the fact that there's no way you can control when you crit. It's a niche that's only really relevant at very specific points in your run. Yes, on 5BC, you can just wait around for some enemies to transform into elites, but risking your own safety just so you can deal crits is just not a good strategy. But how good is it at killing bosses? Well, it does do serious work, but compared to other builds out there, the damage still falls behind a little bit. If you're not critting, the GiantKiller hits like an absolute wet noodle, falling behind in damage already in the second biome. Having to slog through like 95% of the run, not able to get crits, just so you can deal some serious damage in the other 5% is just not very good. First of all, I don't get why it can't be placed in the backpack, since it still wouldn't be busted even if it could. A change I thought was interesting is if the GiantKiller also crits on oversized or large enemies like hammers and golems. It still fits the flavor of GiantKiller, but also adds some viability and makes you think about which items to go to, where this sword will be the most useful. The current version, however, gets a D tier. The previously referenced Gold Digger also came with the Bank update, the perfect weapon for a hoarder. You'll do some crits when your gold count is over 12k, and every hit will drop 10 gold from enemies. A mutation that came with the update that also increases your gold earning rate will definitely help with getting to 12k. The damage on the Gold Digger is one of the highest among survival weapons, so the incentive to crit is there. I should say that just like the Frantic Sword, this weapon is more viable at higher boss cell levels since you get more gold from enemies the harder the difficulty is. And again, this tier list is from a 5BC perspective. And in this case, it's actually currently one of the more powerful survival weapons in the game that changes your whole approach when managing your gold count. Very solid, one of the better design weapons added to the game. Solid S tier. The hand hook is... where do I even get started with this? This weapon follows a 2-hit combo, and on the last hit, it will drag and pull the enemy behind you. First off, the damage absolutely sucks. The crit condition is one that you have to hit something against a wall or against another enemy, but I can tell you that's way harder to do than said. Not only do you have to commit to the full combo to get to the effect, it's even arguable whether the effect is helpful to you at all. Currently, there is zero instance where pulling an enemy behind you is helpful. I can't find any way to synergize this with other weapons, and assuming that you want to keep hitting stuff with a hook, you have to chase down the enemy every time you hook them in. I don't understand what devs want players to do with this. Maybe if they introduce a new weapon down the line that somehow benefits you from facing away from enemies, then hand hook might find some use. Even with the buffed attack speed, the weapon just doesn't work. I can't suggest a rework since I'm not sure what they wanted to do with this, so for the time being, this is going in D tier. Hattori's Katana has the unique move that if you hold down the attack button, you will unsheath your blade and dash forward instead. I love the flavor of this weapon. You can run Predator to turn yourself invisible, then keep dashing into enemies without ever worrying about getting hit. Just do that to chain your way through biomes. The damage is very good, but you'll probably need to just slash away at bosses or even have some support items to make fights shorter. The Katana is one of the few weapons in the game that has 2 separate movesets, still an S tier weapon, but here's to hoping they make more of this. The Hayabusa Boots unfortunately suffers from being easily replaceable. The boots will kick back everything within a radius, including bombs. Now, there is another weapon in the game that already does pretty much the same thing the boots does, but better, and that's Spartan Sandals. Another thing is that if you don't knock things into walls, the damage is pretty lackluster. You can maybe run this as a support weapon that enables something else to work better, but even then, there is literally no reason to use this over the sandals. Because any compliment I can find to give to the Hayabusa Boots, the sandals just do it better. However, because of the speed buff and the ability to easily dispatch flying enemies, the Hayabusa Boots will land at C tier. The other half of the set, the Fists of Malfang, the Hayabusa Gauntlets. When you can do crits with these gloves, I will admit there can be a lot of potential. Fast cooldown on skills, constant crits to activate Sadist effects. The only problem, well, the enemy has to be below 40% HP for it to work. Now, just like the GiantKiller, I don't like it when you can't control the crit condition. There is no other way to get enemy health down unless you just do more damage. Seeing that the effect won't actually trigger for over half of the time, the incredible potential can't really offset the painful process of getting there. Overall, still a fairly decent weapon to experiment with, but don't expect anything spectacular out of this C-tier weapon. The Impaler is weird. While I do like the long range and the fast attack speed, knocking enemies into walls is easier said than done. And immediately some eyebrows will be raised on how this can be achieved consistently. However, I've actually done a video featuring this weapon. My strategy is to use Assault Shield, dashing and pushing enemies back and nailing them with the Impaler. The reason I use Assault Shield over something like the Spartan Sandals is that you want to be able to travel with the enemy. Plus, your biome selection will also kinda matter since you'll want tighter corridors to be able to play this easier. And fun fact, it will actually crit constantly in the Mama Tick fight since she's always against a wall. With Spartan Sandals, some smaller bosses can actually be knocked into walls, and even when you absolutely can't crit in certain select bosses, just its normal damage is still good enough to win you the run. I know the entry requirement for this weapon is quite high, but try it out. It's really not as bad as it looks, because I'm willing to say that this is still a decent A-tier weapon. I have despised the Iron Staff ever since it released in last year's DLC, but after playing with it a little bit, it's actually not that bad. And frankly, it can be quite fun if you can master the weapon, and it's probably known as one of the few weapons in the game that can hard counter the Scarecrow fight. So there are two playstyles with the staff. You can either spam attack and deal damage without critting, or you can play it slower and wait to parry things before unleashing some crits. The parry window on the staff can take a while to get used to, but assuming that you can parry consistently, this weapon has some insane potential with the parry mutations in the game, which almost hardly get used. Think about it, every parry will increase your damage, heal you a bit, and get cooldown on your skills. Pure damage-wise, it's definitely one of the weaker survival weapons, but I can't deny its potential. So let's settle on a middle ground and promote it to B tier, after my initial thoughts on it. The Machete and Pistol is the crossover weapon with Curse of the Dead Gods, and while its animation is among the slickest I've ever seen, the moveset is painfully vanilla. First two hits are swings with the machete and finish off the combo with a blast from your pistol. If you've already seen a familiar moveset in the game, I don't blame you, because that's exactly what the twin daggers do. So not only is the gameplay almost identical, there's also the fact that the pistol shot actually counts as a melee strike. Now, this weapon did get buffs in the last couple updates, so the damage can hold up even in 5 BC. It's mainly a vanity item, so I'm not sure if it's even possible to rework this, but changing the pistol blast to a ranged attack will at least make it somewhat more interesting. Given that it adds nothing too new to the table, this one will go into C tier. Maw of the Deep is yet another weapon introduced in this year's DLC. First off, you swing a freaking shark around. Have I sold you on this weapon yet? Well, I hope not, because this weapon is actually not that good. The shark does crit on rooted enemies, and on the third hit, you will launch the shark and it will root anything it bites into. So theoretically, it can sustain itself. So a couple of things. The crit condition is almost exactly the same as the Nutcracker, and the attack speed is slower. On top of that, because you're throwing the shark, it's possible that it can just outright miss. You're gonna need some practice with this weapon in order to use it well, And while I don't think it's completely unusable, the similarity it shares with an existing weapon that has been a thing since launch doesn't add too much to the table, because any synergies I list here will also apply to Nutcracker later on. In the past, you could do some wonky stun locking on bosses, but they quickly put a stop to that in the latest patch. Overall, C tier for the shark. The Meat Skewer has one of the most interesting effects in the game. Using this weapon as a main DPS can actually be pretty viable, but it's definitely not everyone's cup of tea. The strategy is to dash into enemies repeatedly, like hacking away with a saw blade. The gimmick is that when dashing, you have iframes, which means that if you're good enough, you can dash right through an enemy projectile without taking damage. From the couple runs I practiced with this, I can't pull it off reliably, but that doesn't mean it's undoable. The damage, assuming that you crit, is decent enough to make me feel comfortable about a win. I've always been advocating for this weapon in the past, and now you can also maybe use it as a support weapon for something like the Assassin's Dagger. I have very high regards for the Meat Skewer, so I'll let it remain at S tier. So here's the weapon I was talking about earlier when I was talking about the shark. The Nutcracker benefits from being able to synergize with a lot more survival items. You probably theory crafted some builds with each of the status effects that it can land crits with. Stun with Stun Grenade, Freeze with Frost Blast or Ice Bolt, Root with Wolf Trap or Boy's Axe. Now, on 5BC, one of these status effects is just vastly more powerful than the others, which is rooting. The reason is that Freeze or Stun don't last too long on bosses, so it's really unreliable. However, Wolf Trap and Boy's Axe can actually root bosses for an extended amount of time. I've streamed a run with this weapon last Christmas, and the damage it dishes out is insane for a survival weapon. Just for its sheer versatility, I'm willing to add the Nutcracker to the S tier roster. It's time to oil up, because the next weapon is all about oil. If you play the game a decent bit, you'll know that oil isn't exactly hard to come by. But what is hard to come by is fire. Surprisingly, there really aren't a lot of items in the game that inflict burn. So pretty much anything you can reliably combo with it applies fire in some way. If you're applying blue flames onto enemies, and as I mentioned previously, DOT effects are pretty powerful in this game. The Oiled Sword is a fantastic weapon for beginners to start thinking about synergies and feel rewarded for doing so. However, at the end of the day, there are still better synergies out there. As such, I'm willing to put this in B+. If you've been watching this channel for a while, you'll know that I have a love-hate relationship with the Oven Axe. After saying how it's arguably the weakest weapon in the game, I then proceeded to no-hit the final boss with it. Now, it's to no one's surprise that it's one of the slowest weapons in the game, and it definitely hurts its viability. However, with enough support, and assuming that you can chain together hits, the damage potential is absolutely insane. For bosses, you can try utilizing the Crusher, which can stun lock some bosses in the game. Obviously, I can't just tell you to stun lock bosses, making them unable to attack, and then use a weapon that takes like 5 seconds to get its damage started. But what I am trying to say here is that from a purely damage perspective, the Oven Axe has among some of the highest in the game. You are going to have to earn your way for a win, but it's no trash item. B tier for the Oven Axe. The Panchaku is a brand new weapon in version 3.0 of the game. The inspiration for this weapon started in the Batsy DLC trailer, where the prisoner held 2 Vorpans with a string. And honestly, I can give this weapon style points for just looking so cool. However, since the crit condition is exactly the same as the original Vorpan, any synergies I list here will be shared with Vorpan later on, so I'm just gonna go over them then. The Panchaku is a solid weapon to bring, but because it ultimately shares so much similarity with its original counterpart, I'm gonna have to put it in B tier. Now, I'm gonna take a wild guess and say that this is probably the timestamp that will get replayed the most, but the pure nail is the crossover weapon with Hollow Knight. This weapon has a lot of unique mechanics unseen in any other weapon in the game. You can attack while moving, you can attack upward and downward, you can even pogo off enemies, the same way as you can in Hollow Knight. In Dead Cells, however, you'll probably always want to do upward or downward slashes, since those are the ones that do crits. This can potentially land you in awkward positions where you don't want to use the vertical attacks, but it's strongly encouraged to do them, since the damage is just way higher. While the damage isn't that high for a brutality weapon, I do like the versatility of its attacks. For example, because you can attack while moving, mixing its moveset with the Katana can look really cool. However, a problem does arise when you introduce mechanics that the game just isn't accustomed for. For example, when it released, you can just straight up cheese the Scarecrow and Hand of the King by infinitely pogo hopping. These poor bosses don't even know how to react. There's a lot of potential, but I think it barely makes the cut for S-. Plus, if I put it any lower, I'm gonna be getting some angry emails from Hollow Knight fans. The Queen's Rapier is the signature weapon used by the Queen in this year's DLC. While not nearly as flashy as the boss version, the Queen's Rapier stands out by being able to deal crits moments after you make contact with enemies. Just like a lot of other weapons, I think the damage can hold up decently well in 5BC, and since the delay was even shortened in the latest patch, it's not a bad weapon at all. I'm not sure if it still works, but for some reason the reality slashes actually count as ranged attacks, meaning point blank will actually work with it. I'm not sure if it's intentional, but I'm not gonna list it as a potential synergy. Other than that, I can't list any other noticeable playstyles that makes it stand out that much. It's just a good weapon on its own. As such, I think B tier is a comfortable spot. Alright, normal Rapier next. This weapon specializes in burst damage, and the damage was so busted they had to nerf it. So, is it still any good? Yes it is. Coupled by skills that can support burst damage, like Phaser or Grappling Hook, you can pretty much one-shot any monster in one burst attack. Given that the cooldown for Phaser and Hook are extremely short, you can spam out this combo as quickly as 2K Basketball spamming out their yearly cash grabs. With the Rapier, you can pretty much forget about defense and just go all in on damage. I love this playstyle, as burst damage is really rare in the game. It takes just the right amount of brain usage needed to dish out an incredible amount of damage, but also doesn't overwhelm you on its complexity. Despite the nerf, the Rapier is still enough to warrant an S tier. The Rhythm N Bouzouki arguably boasts the highest attack range in the game. The only caveat is that you have to press the attack button on a rhythm. The trick is to press it when you see the musical note, and you'll know that you did a crit when the radius of the attack is bigger. Assuming that you can master this weapon, you can just wait for enemies to come to you and just blast them with the huge attack radius. This is one of the few weapons in the game where you won't find success just by spamming attack, and I wish there were more weapons like this. Run some good defense support, and you can find a lot of success just whacking things away with your ukulele. The Rhythm N Bouzouki is one of the best survival weapons in the game in my opinion, because they certainly knew what they were doing when they were designing this piece of art. S tier weapon. His music was truly electric. The status Stiletto is one of the most damaging yet brain-dead weapons in the game. The crit condition is very straightforward. You can get bleed or poison from so many skills and items in the game. More easily, just run the open wounds mutation and you'll never need to find another item. Without a doubt, it's one of the more powerful options out there, but I also find it a little too easy to work with. Plus, the range isn't very impressive. While I don't question how good it can be, the lack of creativity in the weapon docks a couple of points from me. Still decent, but B tier is a fair placement. The Scythe Claws is the game's first ever two-handed weapon, meaning it will take up both of your weapon slots. Now, this is going to be a recurring thing whenever I talk about two-handed weapons, but I don't think this design should be normal in Dead Cells. The game is all about using creativity and finding out unique combinations of items to work together with. But two-handed weapons take away part of your freedom by reserving both of your weapon slots. That being said, how does the Scythe Claws hold up? As it turns out, really well. Apart from dealing an insane amount of damage per hit and having a huge range, you can make its attacks even faster by utilizing kill rhythm. I do recommend that you actually try to alternate between the two claws to keep up crits, because the damage of non-crits leave little to be desired. As a new design to the game, the Scythe Claws did an incredible job of showcasing what two-handed weapons are capable of. I think S- tier is the only place fitting for this. The Seismic Strike is, in my opinion, the most overlooked weapon in the game. Having almost no practice with it, it does one thing really well, and that's rooting to no one's surprise. It makes the Heart of Ice mutation a must-pick for the weapon, and since you'll be getting constant cooldown reduction on skills, I would also run some offensive survival tools like the Death Warp or the Cannon. I won't deny its unique properties, but because the Seismic Strike can't crit, its viability as a main DPS is really put into question. Still, for its support purposes, B tier is a fair place for it. Just like Seismic Strike, the shovel also can't crit. Its gimmick is that it can knock away bombs, making it potentially more powerful against certain enemies and bosses that actually throw bombs at you. Against other enemies, however, the damage is a bit below average. I think if they increase the damage on this, it could be an occasional okay support weapon to run. I do like the satisfaction of knocking back bombs with the shovel, if only there were more opportunities to do so. For the time being, I can see the shovel as a below average gimmick with some potential. Once again, B- tier. The Shrapnel Axes utilizes Rapier. The reason this mutation never gets used is that you can't control when your arrows fall out of enemies, but with the Shrapnel Axes, you can. An obvious combo will be the Boy's Axe, since you can also rip the axe out of enemies with that weapon too. Outside of this combo, however, the Shrapnel Axes doesn't perform too well. That being said, having a single powerful way to use a weapon still counts for something in my books, so I can still give it B+ for having that option. When the Snake Fangs got released, I thought it was the best designed weapon in the game. Now that the devs have a bit more experience designing better weapons, I can see how the Snake Fangs has influenced that. There are a lot of ways to use this weapon. Alchemic Carbine or Blowgun for the poison support, and at the same time, the Snake Fangs itself can be used to close in gaps for other weapons like Vorpan or Infantry Bow. So many ways to use it as utility. And it can be really helpful for dealing with bosses that don't like to stand still. Thanks to the constant teleport, you can stick to enemies like glue. I'll admit, it can take a while to get started since you'll need 5 stacks of poison to start critting, but the amount of versatility with the Snake Fangs is off the charts. And I really wish the game would make more weapons just like this one. What can I say? Snake Fangs gets the coveted S+ tier. You may recall earlier in this video when I went over the Hayabusa Boots. Well, the Spartan Sandals does pretty much everything the Boots does, but better. Want support for your weapons that benefit from enemies being far away, like Valmont's Whip or Marksman's Bow? Spartan Sandals. Want an easy way to stunlock elites into walls? The Sandals got you covered. It's gone a long way from the early Dead Cells days, but now it's a serious contender for one of the most fun weapons in the game, and also one of the most solid supports for some other DPS options. Now, admittedly, it doesn't really work in bosses, but you'll probably never need it since you'll have other strategies to fill in the gap. I can't understate how fun the Sandals are to use in biomes, and I certainly won't mind if more weapons like this one are introduced in the future. Still, a decent B tier is my final verdict. I barely hear anyone talk about the spiked boots, and the reason for that is, well, half the time I even forget it exists. However, after trying it out, I realized that it's one of the most overlooked underdogs in the game. The crit condition on the boots reads that you deal additional damage when enemies are right about to attack. Now, I can't even begin to tell you how risky this is to do. You're essentially banking on the fact that you'll defeat the enemy before they hit you. The combo follows 3 hits, the second hit will launch you in the air, and the third will cause you to smack right back down to the floor. The crowd control is great, so those bats won't be a problem. Though the lack of potential synergies hurts this pair of shoes' viability somewhat. The way people are going to play this is just by attacking normally, and maybe landing a lucky crit here and there when you just happen to be attacking when the enemy is about to. You can run the melee mutation to increase the crit window, but if you're sure that you can't land the hit before the enemy attacks, I would just move out of the way. The weapon also runs into some trouble in bosses since their attacks are way slower. And the most surprising of all, I don't believe this item ever got a significant change throughout all of these years. I'd love to see a rework on the spiked boots someday, but for now, it's not gonna change your view on brutality, but it's still a B tier weapon nonetheless. The Scythe Sword is pretty good when it doesn't crit, and absolutely freaking disgusting when you can crit with it. Understandably, a weapon that was introduced in the base game has had a lot of support added throughout the years to really make it stand out. Now, you may have noticed, getting hit erases a lot of your health. So how can there be a way to reliably get hit and activate the crit condition constantly? Well, the Face Flask skill introduced in the crossover update changed all of that. Despite the nerf, the Face Flask pairs up extremely well with the Scythe Sword. Coupled with the Vengeance mutation, it can be a monster of a build, assuming that you can keep your health total at a reasonable amount. People used to intentionally hurt themselves slightly with a block instead of a parry to activate this weapon, But now there is a better way to do it. The viability of the Scythe Sword just shot straight up, and it's honestly one of the more powerful weapons in the game with a fairly high skill ceiling, and that is alone to warrant an A+ tier rating. Gotta go fast, because the Swift Sword is all about speed. Now, you probably figured it out by now that if you kill a large amount of enemies in a short time frame, your character will gain a speed boost, and that's exactly what you'll need to make the Swift Sword pop off. However, since it can make the first couple minutes in a biome feel rather awkward, because you'll still need a couple kills to get the ball rolling. It used to work with Tonic, but now the speed boost effect has been moved to Vampirism. I'll also list Velocity as one of the synergies, but even then, some people don't even run it. For a weapon that favors a fast playstyle, it goes hand in hand with 5BC's environment, where you're rewarded for clearing biomes faster and accumulating less of your malaise gauge. The lack of Tonic hurts it somewhat because you can't really crit in bosses anymore, and let's be honest here, Vampirism is just way less viable. Even still, a solid B tier weapon in my books. You've probably gotten tired of getting beat by the giant lance that Hand of the King uses all the time, so why not turn the tides by using that weapon yourself? This version of the Symmetrical Lance crits whenever it kills 2 enemies at the same time. And while you may think that's really situational, it actually happens in biomes more often than you think, due to the lance's enormous range. However, you're gonna have to rely on its pure damage output in bosses, since I don't believe bosses are generous enough to clone themselves into 2 to let you land crits. Maybe in the Servants fight, but even then, that's a big maybe. It's a fairly decent weapon with a welcoming bonus at times, but overall feels above average to use. B+ for this version of the lance. Coming straight out of a hentai doujin, the Tentacle is a weapon that heavily relies on your abilities to move efficiently. The problem with weapons that have high mobility is how long it takes before the damage actually comes out. You essentially have to position yourself far away from enemies to initiate the dash attack, which is where the crit comes from, but not too far to go out of range. Then you'll have to dash into enemies, reposition yourself again if the first hit doesn't kill, and repeat. I understand that the mobility did get fixed somewhat in a recent patch. The Tentacle still struggles from being way too complex to use, and not getting a worthwhile return out of it. Since you want to be completely focused on using the Tentacle, you can't use other skills in tandem, which further limits synergies. I'm not sure if this weapon can be fixed, but I would love to give it another shot when it does. While the dash can create iframes and the Tentacle can be used from some fringe support utility, the Tentacle is gonna have to stay at C tier. The Tombstone quite literally lets you bury your enemies. This slow hitting weapon has the awesome Doom status to on-screen enemies whenever the third kill does something, and spreads that effect to nearby foes if the effect kills. It can be pretty satisfying to use in biomes, as one hit can potentially clear a whole slew of mobs. However, while it can't work in bosses, the third hit still does a lot of damage to offset it. If the weapon kills on the second hit, no dice. Better find another unlucky enemy to torment. And also, banking the entire effect behind a slow 3-hit combo will only make you hyperly focused on landing that third hit to make the weapon fun, which I rarely think should be the focus on Dead Cell's game design. I've certainly had my fun with the Tombstone, but its risky nature lands it at a B+ tier. The Toothpick, aka a giant club, shares the same properties as the Katana, where there are 2 different movesets. You can either play whack-a-mole by swinging it normally, or holding down the attack button to charge up the swing, which then the club breaks and reconstructs itself seconds later. When it's broken, the weapon attacks faster since it requires less strength to use. I do love the flavor on this thing, but it's a shame that the weapon itself is not very good. These slow swings I can tolerate, but there's almost no incentive to use the charge attack, which is where half of its design takes place. First off, the damage is not that impressive for such a long windup, and when it's broken, it only becomes more difficult to use because your rhythm for the weapon gets interrupted. I love to see a change where there's actually an incentive to break the club, like being able to deal crits when the club's broken, or being able to deal bleed damage since you're jabbing at foes with a broken piece of wood covered in splinters. Due to its clunky nature, the mileage you're getting out of it isn't too hot. C- tier for now, but I do see a lot of potential. The Torch is one of the few fire-based weapons in the game that hits incredibly hard. It has a basic moveset and the range on it isn't too good, so expect those bats to give you a hard time. Just like the oil sword, you realistically just need any source of oil to really elevate your damage. Given that it is a weapon from launch, it held up well these couple of years. It's a staple from the brutality color, but you'll probably need some way to handle those pesky flying enemies from the torch's lack of range. The torch is not without flaws, but the damage vastly outweighs it in my opinion. Still an A-tier weapon all around. The twin daggers is as vanilla as weapons get, though still its damage holds up quite decently. I see it as a tutorial weapon to make beginners learn what critical hits are, since you just need to reach the third hit of the combo to get it. I can't list any noticeable synergies right off the top of my head, since the daggers itself is just good on its own. It's a fairly straightforward playstyle, just hit stuff, land the crits, rinse and repeat. It's good if you're starting out or even on 2 BC, but the lack of variety lands it at a C+ tier. The Valmont's whip is interesting. It can do crits when the tip of the attack hits something. Now, you could just learn how to position yourself, but there are faster, more efficient ways to achieve this. Rooting effects can just hold enemies in place, so you won't have to worry about them moving around and throwing off your aim. You can use Spartan Sandals, where the kick is just enough to let you comfortably land the crits every single time. It's not a big deal if you miss a couple of shots, but if you can master this weapon, the damage is enough to one-shot the giant bears in the cavern. Valmont's whip has a higher than usual skill ceiling, but the payoff for mastering it is enormous. I thought about this a lot, but I do think it's still enough to warrant S tier. The prototype of the Panchaku, Vorpan. The crit condition is exactly the same, so I'll just list off their synergies here. From its fast attack speed to easy to achieve crit condition, there's not too much I can critique about it. However, it suffers from a short range, so be sure to have a backup plan when going against fast-moving enemies. The obvious choice for a damage build will be Grappling Hook and then running the Ski mutation. Since you'll be constantly hooking foes in, the damage just never stops. You can even try being creative and running Snake Fangs to instantly close in the distance, but I find the grapple hook approach to be a bit more reliable. While it is kinda offset by its short range, it's still a pretty decent weapon. As such, B tier is still a commendable spot. The War Spear used to be pretty bad, but now that's no longer the case. The crit condition shares a lot of similarity with the Symmetrical Lance, but the spear only crits when the strike itself hits 2 or more targets. If you think it's a little hard to pull off, you'll be right, because more often than not, you will not be landing those gold numbers. Does that mean the weapon is bad? Well, not necessarily. I think the devs are aware of the fact that it's not exactly the easiest weapon to play because they buffed it by decreasing the delay on the swing and increasing its overall damage. So even if you don't crit, the weapon can still keep up even on 5 BC. It's gone a long way from being one of the worst items in the game, but now it's actually very decent. As such, just for its sheer damage output, I'm willing to promote it to A tier. Well, longtime viewers probably already know where I'm placing the Wrecking Ball, but in case you're not, I'll give a brief overview on why this weapon is just not good. First of all, the weapon is almost without a doubt the slowest weapon in the entire roster as of 3.0. Sometimes you commit to an attack only for an enemy or boss to move out of the way entirely and miss your shot. I understand that the whole archetype of survival is slow and defensive, but the game is really designed for faster playstyles in general, so being slower than enemies can cause you to whiff some attacks altogether. Now, okay, if the speed isn't too good, what about the damage? Can it actually hit hard enough to warrant its atrocious attack speed? Well, kind of. The Wrecking Ball has the interesting gimmick of throwing the ball on the 3rd strike and then pulling it back on the 4th, dealing critical hits along the way. I will admit, the damage from the final hit is amazing, and you get a lot of satisfaction of doing it, but the journey of getting there is not. You have to slog through the 3 incredibly sluggish hits before getting to the last combo, and if you dodge roll or stop attacking for even a short amount of time, the combo will reset. The devs have given a lot of care into this weapon, releasing multiple buffs in recent patches, but I still don't think it's quite enough to be viable. My idea of the buff is to just get rid of the first 2 hits and just let me throw and retrieve the ball instead, but that might be asking for a little too much. For the time being, this big ball stays in D tier. Last but not least, the Wrenching Whip. Unfortunately, it suffers the same way as the twin daggers in the sense that its moveset is extremely vanilla. Again, hit stuff, land the crits on the third hit, rinse and repeat. Not bad at all for a newer player, plus being able to ignore shields is a nice added bonus. Still, it's around the same power level as the twin daggers. While it is pretty decent, the lack of variety lands it in C tier. So, you probably made it here either by going through the entire video or just by skipping to this timestamp. By far, this video was the hardest to make during the runtime of my entire channel so far, totaling over 60 gigabytes of footage, plus days of research and testing out weapons. If you enjoyed this tier list, all I ask in return is that you drop a like on the video. It will really help me out a lot. And that's the full list. Now, in case it's not obvious, the whole point of tier list is that it's one's subjective opinions. Ultimately, you don't have to agree with this list. Again, I can't emphasize this enough, but despite everything I have said in this video, you should still go unlock everything in the game. And on top of that, I would love to know what your favorite weapons are in the comments. Stay tuned for next time when we'll be going over the ranged weapons in the game. And thank you for watching.